Afternoon. Welcome to the Festival Interrupted 2020 interactive event. This is a cross arts virtual festival organised by the School of Performing and Digital Arts at Royal Holloway, University of London. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this afternoon session. My name is Nathan James Dearden, and I am the Performance Manager and Visiting Lecturer in Composition at the Department of Music at Royal Holloway, and have the pleasure as the festival co-manager to welcome a very special guest to talk about their insight into the orchestral music industry. Before I introduce who our special guest is, who I'm sure you already know, a few ground rules on the session which I sent via email, but just to gently remind you. After my introduction, our speaker will present for approximately 30 minutes before we open up the floor for questions and responses. So please could you ensure your mics are muted for this section of the session, just to ensure that there's no residual background noise interrupting the presentation or the guest speaker. Feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to send any questions that may spring to mind as the session develops, and I will bring you to the floor, as it were, during our discussion session or any discussion points that our speaker may encourage you to join. This interactive event is also being recorded for the festival and will be going onto the Festival Interrupted website for you and others to be able to view and engage with this session at a later time. So just so you know. So as a little introduction, Sarah has become quite a close friend and colleague of mine. International conductor Rebecca Miller is celebrated for her energetic presence on the podium and renowned for her extensive work with young musicians. Rebecca has worked with the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, Jerusalem Symphony Orchestra, London Philharmonic Orchestra, the Louisiana Philharmonic, the Houston Symphony, Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra, and the BBC Concert Orchestra at the BBC Proms in 2014, to name only a few. So visit her website if you want the full list. I was tempted to put them all there, but just to make Rebecca blush, but it's quite remarkable. So check out her website if you want to see the full list. Rebecca's varied discography includes releases with the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment on the C.P.E. Bach Symphonies for Signum Records, which made the final shortlist for 2014 Gramophone Awards in the UK. To a personal favourite of mine, a release with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra of piano concertos by Amy Beach, Dorothy Howell, Chaminade on Hyperion Records. She is currently chief conductor of the Uppsala Kammer Orchestra, associate conductor of the South Bank Sinfonia, and her impact as director of orchestras at Royal Holloway, University of London, has seen the music scene blossom at the university since 2014 with the establishment of an orchestral scholarship programme, unlike any other in the world, initiating a side-by-side programme with the London Mozart players, to securing high-profile engagements, including a Magna Carta 800 at Runnymede, a project with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and in the presence of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and 4,000 dignitaries and honoured guests from around the world. Whew, I could just breathe just for a moment. There's so much. But please join me with our virtual hand clapping emojis that you might see on the Zoom feature in welcoming our special guest for this afternoon, Rebecca Miller.
Wow, that's bizarre. Okay, great. Lovely to see most of you. Some of you, I can only see a small selection of you in my screen, but I hope there are more of you there, and lovely to see those who I can see. Thank you very much, Nathan, for that introduction that's made me blush a bit. And I won't spend too much time returning the favor. Nathan is an amazing colleague and has put together a fantastic virtual online festival to replace our play festival, which would have happened at Royal Holloway earlier this month. So a huge congratulations to him for his immense hard work and putting together a really interesting variety of events and online content, many of which that can be accessed after the event. So please have a look at the rest of the website as well if you haven't done so already. So firstly, just I hope everybody remains safe and well, and that everybody is coping with these circumstances. And obviously, if you're here, you are well, but I hope those around you also are, and that you may remain so. I'm hoping that this talk will be as little about coronavirus as possible. It's impossible to have a conversation today without it creeping in like viruses do, but mostly it's about orchestras, their importance, their significance in society, community, leadership, those kind of topics, and the center point is what does the conductor actually do, which many of you may know, but some people watching this afterwards may be coming from well outside the music profession, and hopefully they'll have more of a clue after this session. So I have put together a little PowerPoint presentation. I hope you don't mind. There's a little bit of a presentation section, and then there'll be a few points that I'll bring up for discussion, and we can open the discussion after I present some of my ideas. So hopefully, Nathan, you can see my screen. Just let me know if there's any problems. So I'll start playing the slideshow. Here we are. So in the first slide, we see an orchestra, which is a disturbing sight to see nowadays, all of those people crammed together. But why are they important? Why are they worth saving? What's been missing when we can't get them on stage? I have always thought that orchestras can be a sort of paradigm for our society, and it has really proven to me in the last few months that there are so many aspects about an orchestra, that what an orchestra demands on us, that we should also be demanding on our society. So obviously the collection of people collected together for a bigger goal, an uplifting goal, and working together as a team, as a community. That is the first similarity that I can see, and we can see that in our everyday lives these days in terms of the talk about community and the collective goal of battling this virus. But on stage, we are there as a collection of people aiming to put together a piece of music and uplifting ourselves, challenging ourselves, and uplifting the audience, taking them away from where they are in the concert hall, hopefully, and maybe somewhere else, and inspiring new work. The orchestra has a very careful balance between the individual and the collective. So our musicians train from the time they're 3, 4, 5, young, perfecting their technique on the violin, on the cello, on the flute, and learning about their sound and learning to play their instruments to a certain level. And you spend an enormous amount of time working on your own sound and your own technique to even be able to get to the level of playing in an orchestra. And then when you get to the orchestra, you have to blend, and you have to listen, and you have to be a part of something bigger. So whilst you bring your own individual voice, which is extremely important, without everybody's individual voices, we don't have the color of a section. We don't have the color of an orchestra. So you have to swallow your own voice a little bit in order to blend with the surroundings and blend with the collective. I see an enormous parallel with the social distancing, that we are sacrificing a little bit, maybe a lot, of our own individual contribution to society right now for the bigger collective, and we need everybody to do that in order to achieve what we achieve. So just on stage, we need everybody to bring their expertise. So whilst you have to swallow a little bit of your own artistic choices sometimes, you are still absolutely essential in creating the whole. Listening is a big thing that we do on stage, and that I think all of us could probably do a bit more of in our communities. The listening skills are absolutely intense on stage, and not only listening to yourself, listening to the person next to you, listening to the person across the stage from you, and you're listening continually changing. So depending on what's happening in the music, you are continually focal listening, perspective listening, and bouncing around from listening to the bass line here, and then you know that you have to listen to the horn entry there because you've got to match that sound. So continually listening around, really attentive listening, which is concentrated in a short amount of time. When we all arrive on stage, music is a great equalizer, because it doesn't matter what race you are, what religion you are, what gender you are. We all are sitting there playing our instruments from the same dots on the page. And of course, the questions of equality and race equality have come up in the last few weeks with everything that's been going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. But one thing that I hold most dear about making music with an orchestra is that we're all, it all doesn't matter when we're sitting there performing a piece of music together. There's an element of, lots of elements of trust. Trust in yourself, first of all, trust in the person next to you, trust in your section, trust in your leaders, the leader of your section. You have to trust your leaders. Sometimes a leader may have to do something, make a sudden decision. There has to be a trust of the people behind them. And within any wind section, there are leaders and followers. And then there's the issue of trust with a conductor. The conductor has to trust the orchestra has to trust the conductor. We'll touch on that a little bit later. But in terms of our communities, I think we can see the importance of trust when you're looking to your leaders. When you're most afraid, we're looking to our leaders to lead, and we have to trust them. And you can see lots of instances of how governments have dealt with the coronavirus, and different levels of trust. I think I won't get into a political discussion here, but it's very interesting to see the different levels of trust that people have in their governments, and likewise, and what happens when there is a break of trust or a doubt. It makes or breaks, and it does so on stage as well. Empathy. We on stage, you've got to, as an individual musician, you have to understand the other part of the orchestra. As a concertmaster who's sitting constantly right next to the conductor, the concertmaster has to understand that other people in the orchestra are much further away from the conductor, and that they have to do a lot of compensation. They can't hear as well, they can't see as well. Equally, you might not have as much perspective as you might like. So the idea of continually thinking about how it looks from another perspective is really important on stage, and very important in our lives, of course, and particularly in this pandemic. Humility. I already touched on this about having to, just swallow some things that you really want to say, and some things that you really want to weigh in on, in order to blend in. I think one has to have humility and realize that your voice is important, but it's not the only voice, and that especially if you make mistakes, to own up to those mistakes and to acknowledge them, and that happens a lot in an orchestra. And I think there's also the issue of the corporate sound. When you come on stage for an orchestra, you have to be committed to the fact that we are making something together, and especially as a string player, the corporate sound. A lot of professional musicians talk to our students about the corporate sound, and you have to, and it's different from orchestra to orchestra. You sit in one orchestra one day, it might be very different from another, and you have to absorb that and accept that, because if you start to question that, then there's no way that we're going to even get started. And leadership within an orchestra, leadership roles within our community. It operates the same way. I think people have to accept when they're on stage in an orchestra, whether they are a leader, they have to accept those roles, they have to embrace those roles. If you're not a leader, this is probably harder to accept that you're not a leader. There are all these individually trained, massively talented people on stage. Some people have to be leaders, and some people have to be not leaders for that particular moment. Maybe everything will change for the next performance, but there has to be an acceptance, if you are not a leader, that you are not a leader. The last one on this slide is flexibility and adaptability. So orchestras have to be continually flexible. Every time you play a passage of music, it's different. It's slightly different. It's the same notes on the page, the same musicians, it will sound slightly different. And you have to maybe make some adjustments, and you have to be flexible. You have to be adaptable. And just like in our society, we have to be adaptable and flexible, and especially now with changing guidelines and all of this, we have to very quickly adapt our lives to those around us and those circumstances around us. So that's a little bit about how I think an orchestra can be a model for society. A few additional roles of the orchestra that I think in society: to entertain, although I don't like that word, I couldn't find a better word. We're not singing and dancing, but there is an element of you come watching us do something, listening to us do something. I think it's also imperative that an orchestra helps to educate its public, not to sound, not to look down on its public, not to sound in any way condescending, but to educate, to an orchestra and a music director and a staff of an orchestra has to decide what music we play. Do we play all the traditional canon? Do we play lots of contemporary music? Do we play music by female composers, by Black and minority composers? It's our job to give that to our audience, for them to hear and to judge. They may like it, they may not like it, they'll let us know, but that's part of an education, like a curator of a museum. In the same respect, I think an orchestra is obliged to represent its community. So if there's a lot of one particular ethnic group, I think that needs to be represented in the programming and the activities that an orchestra puts on. I was for 3 years in New Orleans, and there was a huge emphasis on incorporating music by Black composers and Black musicians, and jazz, and all the amazing cultural ingredients that make up New Orleans, to try to connect with New Orleans' unique community. And a program in New Orleans should look different than a program in Chicago, than a program in a different city, depending on its community. And that community may change over time as well. And therefore, orchestras should be willing and able to adapt their programming depending on who's there. And obviously to uplift and inspire its audience. I think sitting and looking at an orchestra is, like, for me, like looking at an amazing machine in the Science Museum. You look at all these different parts working together. You can hone in on the little parts, and then you can sit back and watch them all working together. And there are millions of studies that show that the complexity of an orchestra, the complexity of looking at a machine like that, expands our brain and uplifts us and stimulates creativity and creative thinking, problem solving, all of that. So I think that in a unique way, an orchestra, I think music does that in any case, live music, but an orchestra in particular, with all of its different visual components of people working together, and audio components as well, I think really is quite unique. So I put up here just a discussion point. If you want to touch on it after the presentation. I started thinking as I was preparing this presentation, does music exist when it's just in its printed form? Because I thought, when we decide what music to play, what is music? Is it the performance of music? Is that music? Or is it the music? Is the score the music? It's an interesting question. I don't have the answers for you, but I thought maybe it would be an interesting discussion to start. And is it like a Shakespeare play? Does the play exist in its written form? Just an idea to discuss afterwards. So we're going to throw that one away for the moment. And what does a conductor actually do? We're going to get to this part of the presentation, which I'd quite like to know. So there's a favorite cartoon of mine, which, yeah. So that's not what a conductor does, and that's not what it says on our scores, believe it or not. But I thought it was amusing. So what does a conductor actually do? Well, here is an example of, well, I'm not going to say anything more. It's Leonard Bernstein, and I think he speaks for himself. Nathan, give me a thumbs up if you can see and hear. Okay, good. We could all sit here and watch Bernstein all day. I don't know about you, but what does a conductor actually do? Well, there it looks like he's actually doing relatively little. Absolutely nothing is what some people would say, but actually he's doing quite a lot. So he's not conducting at all. What does a conductor do? They wave their arms. He's not moving his arms at all. Now, he is a bit of a show-off, Mr. Bernstein. We know that. The point about this is that he is conducting, but he's not moving his arms at all. So it's not about waving your arms, clearly, because clearly it can be done without waving your arms. It also can be done without even, it can be done with even less than what he's doing. So let's have a look at some of the things that a conductor actually does. If I can get the next slide. Oh no, don't go again. There we go. So, well, clearly, Mr. Bernstein knows the score, doesn't he? He knows what's coming next, and he knows exactly when to raise his eyebrows. And it's not just that he feels the music, he knows every single note in there. And so our first job is to know the notes, to know the score. You spend months and months and months looking at the score, studying it, first of all, knowing it, absorbing it, digesting it, trying it different ways. And ultimately, when you're standing up there, if you have a score in front of you, you are the only one with all of the parts in front of you. For those who are outside the music business who don't know this, every musician has their own part, and the conductor has all of those parts moving simultaneously. So you're overseeing all the workings of this machine together. So you got to know everything about it, and that's immensely complicated. You might have 20 lines moving all at once through a 40-minute symphony. That's a lot of material to know. You have to have a good amount of knowledge of orchestration and instrumentation. So you have to know how the musicians produce their sound, and therefore when you're asking them to do something, you have to know whether you're asking them to do something that's, one, possible, maybe two, impossible, whether it's something that's difficult or not difficult. You have to, so in certain ranges of certain instruments, it's more difficult to play soft in one range and loud in the other. And you have to know when you're asking your musicians to do something, what they have to do in order to produce that sound. There are certain speeds for the violin off the string that work, and certain speeds that just don't. So if you're asking for the impossible and you're not getting it, there's a bit of a disconnect there. So a knowledge of all the instruments of the orchestra is pretty essential. It used to be that conductors played all the instruments of the orchestra. George Sell was reputed to have been able to play every instrument of the orchestra better than all the people sitting in the Cleveland Orchestra in front of him. But some knowledge of some instruments, you need to be have played some instruments, preferably an orchestral instrument, so that you have some empathy. There's that word again. Once you know the score, in the process of developing your knowledge of the score, you are developing an artistic vision of the piece. You are learning about its architecture, how it's put together, and therefore how you can lead us, how you can lead the orchestra through this piece. The musicians spend their time rehearsing their part, which is an incredibly difficult job to do. And your job is to have the wider view as to how this is all put together and have confidence in that vision, so that you bring everybody with you. So at this point, I'll just mention another discussion point is interpretation. We might talk about interpretation. What is interpretation? Is it our job to interpret the music, or do we just are we just realizing it from the dots on the page to the ears of the audience? Question. I consider myself the chief decision maker. There are lots and lots of decisions to make. Yes, we all start with the same notes in front of us, but there are lots of decisions in terms of the speed that you take the piece, in terms of the balance of the orchestra, who we're listening to when. It's like a recipe. You know, you open up a Delia Smith recipe. She says a few things there, but there's infinite variety in terms of, you know, how small do you chop the apples, and it makes a big difference in terms of what shape they are. And you know, there's lots of decisions to make in terms of how you realize a recipe. And just is the same way in terms of dynamics, our articulation, all the details of bowing can make a big difference in terms of how a piece sounds. So there's all these decisions to be made before you even get to the first rehearsal. And then they all need to, some of them need to be made within the first rehearsal. Once you get there, all of your decisions may not work, and you may have to throw them all out the window when you meet the orchestra and suddenly decide on a different path because it's not working. So that comes later with flexibility. But chief listener, I always say I'm the only one on stage who's not making any noise. I'm the only musician on stage who's not actually making music physically. But that enables me to be the only one on stage who is completely 100% dedicated to listening. And it's an active listening. It's having the perspective of the audience, but having the power of a performer to change things and to alter things and to change the way things work on stage. So it's a very exciting place to be. And of course, you do have to wave a stick sometimes. I mean, Bernstein does actually move his arms during some performances, if you haven't seen him. And he does it fantastically well, might I say. But there is the technique of actually stick technique. And it's not so much with a baton. You can work without a baton, but it's gestural technique I should have put there. But I thought stick waving was more fun. But it's how to show with your hands the sounds that you want, and with your face. You saw Bernstein doing a lot with his face there. There's an incredible amount that's involved with your facial expressions in terms of how you express to the orchestra. Then after all of this, you have to persuade all these people on stage, and we will get people on stage again, I'm convinced about it. You have to convince all these people on stage that they should come along with you on this artistic vision. So you have to have enough confidence, and so much confidence that you can convince everybody else in the room that this is the way it should be. And the way I approach this is that this is not the way it has to be forevermore. This is the way it's going to be today. And I may change my mind tomorrow. I may change my mind when we get into the hall. I may change my mind a little bit in a different circumstance. But today, right now, while we're playing it, we are committed to this way, this tempo, this articulation, this phrasing. This is the way it has to be. And even when you step off the podium, if you rethink things and do things slightly differently, I think that's fine and that's human. But this involves techniques of negotiation, which we don't tend to use that word in music making very much, but really it is a negotiation. It's a negotiation with the people on stage. And you have to enable the people to realize your artistic vision. So I have to give them my trust, my big breath, that then I have to let go a little bit, because then I have to trust them to play. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the final section of this. But I am an enabler. I've got some ideas. I've got to convince these people, and then I've got to enable them to do it. So I've got to enable them to listen to each other. Sometimes my job, a lot of the time, is about guided listening. Violins, can you please listen to the bass a bit more? I say that quite a lot. So it's to do with guided listening, enabling them to have the tools to do their job and to not get in their way too much. And outside the orchestra, outside on stage, you are a community leader. And this is a big part of what a conductor actually does. This is beyond the actual flapping of the arms or flapping of the eyebrows. This is a part of the role as a community leader, whatever that community might be, even if it's within a university or within a small town or a larger community. So that's a few things that the conductor actually does. And I mentioned that a discussion point that I thought was interesting is, what is interpretation? Is it our job to interpret, or are we just translators? A question for all of you. Conscious of time, I'm going to move straight along. And the last section I will go through reasonably quickly, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about leadership, and then I'll open up for discussion, because I'm sure if you're anything like me, you're probably tired by the sound of my voice by now. Leadership, of course, we talked a bit about vision and purpose. A leader has to have a clear purpose for its for people to follow it, for people to buy into it, and a clear vision. Honesty and integrity is really important. I think any leader has to have a certain amount of transparency and honesty and humanity, and realize that we're all humans, and this is my view. I may make mistakes, I may be wrong, but this is what it is, and be honest. The issue of trust I mentioned a little bit before, but I cannot stress how important it is in terms of your role as a leader, your role as a conductor, to trust the orchestra, to trust the people in front of you. And this doesn't matter whether the people you are in front of are a group of 6-year-olds or a group of 96-year-olds. You have to trust them at a certain basic level. I have to trust that they're going to give me something. And if I trust them completely, it's amazing how much trust comes back. Confidence. It's sort of stating the obvious, but you have to be really, really confident in what you're trying to convey. And in your ideas, you have to have confidence, and in yourself, and how you hold yourself, how you gesture, what's your body language, a confidence. Because if you can't be confident in your ideas, you can't expect people around you to be confident in them. Communication skills. In front of an orchestra, certainly there's definite verbal communication skills and nonverbal. Nonverbal we talked about in terms of facial expressions and gestural expressions, of course, as a conductor, but even facial expressions. And this is not just limited to conducting. I mean, I'm very conscious of what my face is doing, because it might be misinterpreted by some of the people in front of me. If I'm making a sour face, if I make a mistake, I tell this to conducting students all the time, that if you make a mistake, try not to show it on your face, because the people in front of you may not realize that it's you're frowning at. They may think you're frowning at them, and then it sets up this whole dynamic of, okay, well then I'm going to frown back at you, and all of these things that go on. So you have to be really careful that your face says, it doesn't have to be smiling all the time, certainly, but that it doesn't express a sort of displeasure, because that could really be misinterpreted. Verbal communication, I'm always conscious the way that I speak to an orchestra, that I'm always trying to be concise, except for today, I'm not being very concise, sorry about that. But that I'm always framing my comments to the orchestra in a way that is clear and that gives them a positive action to take afterwards. So of course you want to let them know why it is that you stopped, why it is that what issue it is you want to correct or fix. But I try to always frame it in a way of, instead of saying you were too loud there, can you be a bit quieter there? It makes a big difference. And I think that leaders do have to think about the way that they frame things to people. Not that you have to pander to people, but I think it gives them an action to take rather than taking it first as a critique. So there's a lot of subtlety. I could do a whole presentation just on verbal communication with an orchestra. I won't bore you with that now. I also try to use a sense of humor in, and I think that's really, really important to, I use a lot of food analogies in my rehearsals, because I think that everybody eats and everybody relates to food. So if I'm referring to a sort of chocolate fudge kind of sound or something like that, I think that everybody relates to that, and it makes them smile. When people smile, then get in there, get playing, because then they play their best when they've just had a laugh. Especially with choirs, it works really well. You get them to laugh and then you get them to sing right away. They make a really nice sound after they've been laughing. As a leader, you have to be, again, humble and accountable for your own mistakes. Every leader is going to make mistakes. Every conductor is going to make mistakes. I believe there used to be an era of that conductors, they just didn't admit when they made a mistake, and it had to be somebody else's fault, because of course you weren't making any noise. How could you have made the mistake? I tend to teach in my conducting that look at yourself first to see whether you caused what happened. Sometimes you didn't cause what happened, but most of the time you probably did something that made these people nervous, that caused something to happen, or made them unsure. So accountability. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying, look, hey, my bad, in a rehearsal, can we just do that again? I think that it puts us all on the human level. As a leader, you have to learn how to delegate and empower your team. So this is leaving decisions up to the section leaders and not micromanaging your players, not micromanaging your team. If you want everybody to buy into your vision, you've got to give people freedom and the sense that they are part of the decision making. And so I always try to, and that's involving with trust as well, to trust your team to make decisions and to let go of some of those decisions. Trust that they will make decisions that will buy into your vision. Empathy, we talked about this already, about a leader understanding what your team has to do in order to make your request happen. So as a music director, you have this great programming idea. You have to understand what needs to happen in order for that programming idea to happen. You have to, what the marketing people have to do in order to market this crazy idea that you've had, how much it's going to cost, and what the finance people are going to have to go out and do and raise money for this idea. What kind of personnel are involved, and are you going to have to find a weird peepaw player or something for this crazy idea that you have, and where are we going to find that? So when you have an idea, knowing what all the little parts of the machine have to do in order to realize this idea, and this works on stage and off stage as well. Resilience again. You're standing up there, you get all sorts of stuff thrown at you all the time as a leader, as a conductor. You have got to be strong. You've got to brush it off. This is probably one of the hardest things personally for me about the job, because we're sensitive musicians. We're sensitive, but actually you can't be too sensitive when you're standing up in front of an orchestra, because you get thrown all sorts of stuff, most of which has nothing to do with you, but you have to throw it off and brush it off and listen. Yes, understand. Okay, fine, but completely collapse and and can't be able to go on? Probably not. So you need to be able to have some resilience. And that's also tied in with emotional intelligence, which one key thing that I've always stuck to is trying to leave my emotional baggage at the door when I walk in the rehearsal room, trying to leave my personal stuff at the door when I walk in the office. There's nothing worse than, I think, than a conductor who's in a really bad mood, who starts in a bad mood right before you've even had a chance to play anything. He's frowning or she's frowning at you. So I try always to leave, no matter what kind of bad stuff's been going on, I try to leave that at the door and just focus on the people in front of you, because it's not fair on the people in front of you who may have had a very good journey to work, as opposed to yours, which was, horrendous. So that's one thing. Prioritizing others' issues above your own is another part of this. And conflict resolution, you're continually having to deal with conflict resolution in your team. Lots of highly strung musicians in front of you, big egos who have big beliefs about the music that they're playing, will inevitably clash at some point, and you are often there to pick up the pieces and to get people moving again. And managing your emotions, also very, very important. So I think that's the end of my formal sort of presentation. I think, is there anything? Yeah, okay. So if we want to open up for discussion, questions, I have not seen if there's anything in the chat. I can't see the chat right now, but I'm going to ask Nathan to sort of guide the next section of this. So thanks very much for paying attention.
First of all, Rebecca, thank you so much for what was a really heartfelt and insightful set of advice and guidance. I think this should be published somewhere. So yeah, thank you so much for all of that. I've got tons of questions. I filled up a whole notebook of questions. Please feel free, as I've mentioned in the chat, if you do have questions and you don't want to sort of come out and say them, feel free to utilize the chat function below. But I will start off with a question, if that's okay. I'll take my host priorities and ask, you majored as a pianist at Oberlin. Why a conductor as a career choice?
Yeah, it sort of evolved from chamber music. I played violin, piano, flute, all growing up. And first of all, I loved making music with other people. And that was, I think that's the thing that probably is it's just selfish. I just liked being around lots of other people. I didn't enjoy being in the practice room by myself. Lots of people do, and some people don't, and they still do it. But I loved making music with other people. But also, I felt that my connection to music was in learning about the music, how the music is put together, the history behind this particular composer, analyzing it harmonically, figuring out all the little details of how the piece is put together. I was fascinated by this, and I wanted to spend more time doing that than practicing the piano. So here's a job where I actually get paid to figure out all this stuff and to study the score. And yes, I do practice my conducting technique. Of course, there's lots to be practiced there, but that's where my passion was, and it evolved out of having playing piano in a piano trio. And I found that I sort of naturally fell into a leadership role because I had the parts in front of me. And actually, my mother suggested the idea one day to me. She said, "Have you ever thought about being a conductor? You've got experience in all of these instruments, and you seem to enjoy the leadership role. Have you ever thought about it?" And I said I'd never thought about it before, but the idea, I couldn't quite get the idea out of my head.
Yeah, beautiful. There is a comment here from Bob Gross. Fabulous presentation, Rebecca. Bob and Val are watching and learning. Bravo. We've also got a question as well from Sylvia Fraser. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, Sylvia, and ask the question yourself.
Hi.
Yes. Woo, yeah. We can hear you. Hi, Sylvia.
Thank you, Nathan, for allowing me to join at the last minute. Hi, Rebecca. fabulous job. It's so well spoken, beautiful, wonderful. I wanted an example of how you might get musicians to listen to each other really well when they're not doing as much as they could, particularly when you've got them at opposite ends of the stage or in a bad acoustic or something like that.
Oh, good question, Sylvia. Sylvia always asks good questions. Well, first of all, strip everything away and see, because possibly it's just that there's too much other stuff going on. So if the first violins and the timpani aren't together, let's strip away everything else. Let's have just the first violins and the timpani, and let's maybe even just have them sit and listen to the timpani part while they follow their own part. So quite often I will do that, and I won't say this is because we have to listen more. I can say, I might frame it whereby, can I just hear the timpani there? Which doesn't put them on the spot, maybe puts timpani player on the spot. I see Jess grinning there as she knows what it's like to be a timpanist there. So yes, so I try to isolate things because I try to make it easier for the musicians to hear on stage, and having that empathy, asking them, you know, can you hear across the orchestra, or is it really bad in here? Because you know, I'm standing on a podium. It's a lot easier for me to hear, even being 6 inches above the ground. If I'm not given a podium and I'm on the flat, it's really hard for me, not only because of my back, but actually it's really hard to hear when you're on the ground. So having that empathy with the musicians of sort of, I trust that they can hear, but if they seem to be struggling, I think there's probably some problem that we need to try to sort out.
Thank you.
Great question. As I said, if anybody does have a question, feel free to pop your hand up, because I can see all your faces, or pop something into the chat and I can bring you to the fore. I'll carry on with another question if that's okay, in the meantime, whilst other people are percolating some questions. I've got down here, you mentioned about the conductor as an individual versus the collective, and where the conductor fits within a collective, within a community. How do you, in practice, perhaps through example, find that balance? That's a hard question as well, I'm sorry.
Find the balance of?
Within being an individual person, conductor, who's making the chief calls, but then within the collective and making music, how do you find that balance in examples?
Well, when I'm conducting, it's happening all the time. Every bar, I'm switching between leading and listening, and leading and listening, and leading and listening, and listening a bit more and leading a bit more, because it's like driving a car. You have to just keep your foot on the clutch, and you can't really take your eyes off the road. And yeah, there's sometimes when you can do what Bernstein did, and you can just sit back and actually let the orchestra do a lot of the work. So, and then the longer you do this, the more you realize there are fewer points when you actually need to come in and grab the reins. And I remember being completely bowled away by Bernard Haitink coming into the Royal College when I was a junior fellow there, and he conducted Shostakovich 8, I think it was. I think it was Shostakovich 8. In any case, he knew exactly, this is a massive piece of music, and he knew exactly when, and not too early, to reach that peak, and exactly when to really, you know, turn on the gas. So it's a question of just continually keeping that balance. But in terms of in my own life, I mean, it's a continual battle as well, in terms of raising my kids, in terms of my family life, in terms of, I'm continually thinking about this, my individual voice, and sometimes I've got to just sit back and let the rest of them argue and just sit on my hands. So I think it's a continual balance in all of our lives in terms of getting along with the people around us, but yet having our sort of purpose.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, particularly purpose. We've got a question from Peter Willen, if you wanted to unmute yourself, Peter.
Hi, Rebecca. A great presentation, fantastic. Can I ask you how we can sell the orchestra to young musicians, young, I'm talking about school children now. How can we get, this country has such a problem at the moment, particularly in the UK. I see some people from overseas, but I guess it's a worldwide problem of getting young people to get interested in music, and the orchestra in particular.
You use the words, how can we sell the orchestra to young music? Well, I don't think we have to sell it to them. We give them an instrument and they love it. So the more instruments, the more they can play, and the more they can participate with other people, and the more they can hear live music and be surrounded by live music, the better. I'm passionate about music education, and yes, I think there is a big problem. And I come from California, where there was very little music in my school compared to what there is here. And, you know, so I know what it's like to, you know, I wasn't given musical instrument lessons in my school. I did everything privately. I was very, very lucky. But it has to start young. I remember I was involved with an amazing project with James Rhodes and Channel 4 and Don't Stop the Music. And we surprised a school that he'd been working at a school in Basildon that had little to no music program at all. And with the South Bank Symphonia, we came up with this project. We showed up there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the whole orchestra snuck in with that while and rehearsed. And then the children went to their classrooms. They had no idea what was going to happen. The school was surrounding the main hall. All the classrooms were surrounding the main hall, so you could hear everything going on in the main hall very quickly. As soon as they had their form time, we started playing Beethoven 5 as a surprise, and then they filtered a couple of the classes in, and many of these kids had never heard an orchestra before, certainly never seen an orchestra before, and their faces were, you know, shock, horror. Some of them were, it was so loud, some of them big smiles on their faces, and it really inspired them. And we saw the faces of these kids, and they couldn't stop talking about it for weeks afterwards. Just hearing the sound, even that was even before you got instruments in their hands, but just hearing the sound. So the more we can go out to the schools and get them to hear live music, get involved in live music, I don't think it's going to take much of a sell, but it does take a lot of very, very hard on the ground work by a lot of us. Yes. And money, of course.
I was just going to say that's an excellent response. And also, I think we just need to be, as people in places of responsibility, ensuring that these music hubs across the country are being utilised and exist and are maintained and are thriving and pointing people in the right direction, because there are some areas where they just don't know that music hubs exist either. I think that's super important. Peter, who is with Sylvia, just commented actually saying, over here in Switzerland, they voted overwhelmingly to keep music education in schools. No individual tuition, however, but it is taught well and continually until the age of 15. The kids also go about once a year to a children's opera or concert, which is fantastic. And similar initiatives like that by Music Making UK, for instance, as an organisation and a charity, do work like that in the UK, which is fantastic.
I think it has to be viewed not. We have to change people's minds that it's an option. It has to somehow. We have to somehow make our way back to it being an absolutely essential part of education. I mean, there are a lot of things that have dropped off the education. You know, you don't stop an average person and have them be able to know Latin for you, but that used to be much more common. So a lot of things have fallen off the curriculum, but we have to get back to a place where music and art, but particularly music, as that's where I live, is an absolutely essential part of education. It cannot be an option any longer. We see that we can't live without it now. You know, everybody's drawn to these productions and art and theater and music online in the time of isolation. We need it, but not only do we need it, we don't need to just be entertained by it. In order for the audience to really appreciate it and understand it, they should have had it from the time that they were young. And a lot, there's a whole generation that's missing that now, but it needs to be a real part of the education system, which it isn't at the moment.
It'd be wonderful that in a few years' time that we don't seek charity support for arts, but it is a state-funded necessity, as you mentioned. That'd be wonderful to see. And Fizz Markham just commented then saying, hopefully COVID-19 will bring the essential nature of the arts to public notice. Without the arts, mental health would degenerate. Absolutely true. We've all found that being in lockdown. As I've mentioned, still feel free to pop in any questions into the chat. I've got a question, a follow-up question actually to that in some ways, where you talk about a community of players and being within a community. As this is being hosted by Festival Interrupted at Royal Holloway, University of London, I'm wondering, within Royal Holloway, what is that community there for you?
That's a very good question. It's a university, so it's it's a collection of knowledge seekers and teachers. So the community is a microcosm of society almost. It's got an engineering department, it's got a management school, it's got a science department, it's got languages departments, drama department. So you've got all of these things right on our campus at Royal Holloway. We're lucky that it's all within a campus university, so that stuff can happen where and music is one of those few subjects that can really reach out. I almost imagine if I were to be able to build a university like the concert hall, and the best cafe would be right in the middle, so that the music would stream everywhere, and those conversations at the cafe with the best coffee could happen within the center. And that means that people from all sorts of different departments would be exchanging information, and music can really be that bridge to stimulate creativity, and it speaks to so many different departments. So I see that as our community, in terms of not just the music community. I mean, we're just a part of the wheel. But yeah, I try to always remind everybody around me that we're all here. There's a reason why we're all on a campus together. Otherwise, we should just be, our own music department on our own campus somewhere, and the own engineering school. But no, there's a reason why it's called a university.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I've got one more follow-up. We will go over a little bit. So if people did have a burning question, do let me know, and I can push you to the stage, as it were, to ask it. But I have one further question, which links actually to the title of this session of the MaestrA, not the Maestro. And as a woman conductor in 2020, what is your role as a conductor? As a woman conductor, and also in terms of programming as well, how has that been impacted, and how has that fed into the conversation for you as a conductor?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a particular role as a woman conductor as opposed to any other conductor, but I think one does have to acknowledge the minority. I used to just brush it off and say, no, there's no issue, there's nothing. But the last few years, I have acknowledged, no, there's a problem here, and we have to team together. We've got to do something about it. And it's great that there are lots of men on board with the project. I mean, James Murphy at the South Bank Symphonia when I was there, and now he's at the Royal Philharmonic Society. He has been a champion for the cause of women conductors. And it'd be great to have more men involved at that level. And there are lots who are putting in a lot of effort towards providing more opportunity and visibility for women conductors and female composers as well. I do think it is my job a little bit to be a little bit of a role model for younger women. So I do see that if they see more women on the podium, then it becomes more even a possibility for them to take on conducting or another leadership role. Just as the Chineke Orchestra is putting up, Black and Asian and minority people up on the stage to say, yes, look, I mean, you don't even have to say anything. You just go to a concert and people say, yes, I can see those people upstairs on the stage. They look like me. So that job as a role model does definitely enter my mind all the time. So I think it shouldn't just be my job to do. It shouldn't just be the job of female conductors to do female composers. In fact, it should really be opposite. And that you mentioned the CD of Amy Beach and Chaminade and Dorothy Howell. Well, my husband Danny is a pianist on that, and he absolutely was insistent that he thought there has to be a male pianist playing this music, because otherwise it's just all women doing women's music with women composing. Women.
It becomes siloed in itself.
It becomes niche and cliche. So we need more men standing up for female composers. But I do feel it's part of my role to push that. So
yeah, and opening up that conversation is the most important thing. I think that's wonderful, and you are a wonderful role model. It's even exemplified just in the group chat. Fizz Markham, who's currently a finalist at Royal Holloway, said it's been a fantastic experience to have been part of Royal Holloway Symphony Orchestra for the past 4 years. I've really enjoyed it and gained so much in the process. And a role model for an older woman too, with a little cheeky face there. Just to finish up, we do have a question here from Tom Search. He's alumni from Royal Holloway. He says he has 2 questions.
Hi there, can you all see me? Sorry, I realised my video was up for a moment. Hiya. I've got 2 questions for you, Rebecca, actually. I'm just really interested to see what your opinions on them. So the practice of conducting and physically the actual conducting technique is a product of the forces in front of it and the feedback that comes from the people in front of you, and it's built up over time. So in a socially distanced world and within a socially distanced ensemble, how do you see that impacting the way that the way that you conduct? Can you see any ways in which gestures or technique will change as a result of people being slightly further apart or in different sides of the room? And secondly, I was just wondering, obviously with orchestras at the moment or a lot of them facing some worrying solvency issues, and we just saw from that video the fact that orchestras can, when they've got a Bernstein in front of them, or when under Vienna Phil, they might not need a conductor in front of them, and a lot of them could potentially do it by themselves, or a lot of it unaided. What's the long-term viability of the conducting role?
2 great questions. So I assume you mean, by your first question, I assume you mean like when you've got people on stage but they're 2 meters apart, like how might that affect? I haven't tried it yet, so I'll keep you posted about that. But what I've heard from my colleagues, that it's more difficult than it looks. You know, it looks easy on the page, but when you speak to them, they say it's really bizarre. It's a little bit like you're in a vacuum. And I imagine that the first instinct would be bigger gestures, but I imagine that probably won't be as effective, because with everybody that much further apart, you want to draw them together, and instead of using bigger gestures so that they can definitely see, you probably want to focus their attention more on the visual. There's going to be a lot more compensation that people are going to have to go through in order to play together, and so tempos may be affected. I should think that you may have to take different tempos in order for them to really be able to hear each other. I mean, the orchestra cannot play together unless they can hear each other, and if they can't hear each other, then you might have to slow things down a bit. I'm just guessing here, as I haven't had the opportunity to try socially distanced performance yet. Not sure I'm terribly excited about the idea, but it's an interesting prospect. Those might be some initial thoughts, but I think the whole idea of understanding what your musicians are going through comes to the fore in those kind of circumstances, especially that this is going to be new to all of us, and that they're going to be getting used to it. So you have to have a bit more patience with your orchestra. You have to have a bit, maybe there's a bit more flexibility, a bit more resilience towards change and being able to try different things. Maybe you'd have to set up the orchestra differently. I mean, maybe we should be doing that anyway, because we're creatures of habit the way we have the orchestra. I did a session with the management school last year, and suddenly I decided on the spot to change the seating of the orchestra. I switched the brass from side to side. I moved the back row of the winds to the front row of the winds, and I asked everybody in the strings, if they were in the front of the section, to move to the back of the section. And everybody's perspective totally changed. And they thought, wow, why don't we do this more often? Because suddenly I hear, I mean, well, actually, the people who moved to the back thought we should go back to the way it was. But everybody else thought, wow, it's amazing. I get so used to sitting where I'm sitting. So it could lead to some really interesting ways of mixing up the sound and where we're sitting. Your second question, which I've completely forgotten now, I was going to write it down. Just remind me.
No, yeah, it was just in the current climate with orchestras facing solvency issues, and you see videos like Bernstein where orchestras are able to complete a lot of the performances by themselves. What is the viability of the conductor in a space like this, in an economic space like this?
Yeah. We are. This is not something new to conducting. I ask myself every day when I'm conducting, do I actually need to be here? Which I think is a good question to ask, because a lot of it happens without. I mean, that was what that video showed, is that a lot of it happens without us having anything to do with it. The orchestra does a lot of this on our own. We're there for a different purpose. I think that the idea of the community leader and the things off the podium are going to become even more important in a role in the future. With all of this, we are having to now be community activists, and with Peter's question about education and our role in the community is now going to really fall on our words and getting governments to take action and put money into the arts and put money into arts education, and that the role is going to become much more about that than it ever has been in the past. I hope we do get to the point eventually where we've got big orchestras on stage and that we are needed again. But I don't think it changes the role particularly. I think once we get orchestras back, conductors will have a role to play. But I think that's always our role is not stick waving, not carving. It's a much bigger thing. It's much having perspective, and it's also the communication of what's going on stage with what's going on in the community or the government or whatever situation you happen to be talking about.
Great, thank you.
We have a comment, actually, a follow-up comment from Jessica Cooling. She's alumni at Royal Holloway and is currently orchestra manager for the London Mozart Players, who Royal Holloway has a close affiliation with. And she says, LMP do a lot of directed concerts as a chamber orchestra, and it's a different experience to having a conductor. Later and larger works aren't very viable directed. It gets a bit chaotic, I can imagine. Our socially distanced orchestra was very strange. Even with just 12 players, people said they felt too far away. We had a 23-piece string orchestra broadcast on the 4th of July, which you can still check out on their website. And we'll be using a different layout to help combat distance. I think that's very interesting. We have time just for one quick question. It's a nice one, actually, that's just come to me, and I'll invite Becky Ryland-Jones.
The other questions were nice too.
Yes, oh yeah, absolutely, to finish off, sorry. But this is a particularly nice one to finish off on. And it's from Becky Ryland-Jones, who is alumni as well, of course, and was on our orchestral committee at Royal Holloway. And I'll invite Becky to ask that question.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, is there a particular conducting experience that really stands out to you as special? And if so, what made it so special?
Oh, gosh, that's a difficult question. That's like the question of who's my favorite composer or which one of my children do I like better. I don't have an answer to that. I'd like to say that all of my performances are like that, and it seems a bit of a cop-out to say that, but if I'm not committed to the performance, then I'm not doing my job. So in a sense, every orchestra, every concert does feel like that. Inevitably, there are some that are much more exciting than others. Is there a conducting experience that stands out? I mean, there are conducting experiences that definitely stand out. I mean, conducting in front of the Queen at the Magna Carta, that one stands out, especially because I had to step off the podium mid-Elgar, shake her hand, try not to throw up on my shoes, and then get back on and continue conducting Elgar. That was definitely a unique experience. I've had experiences in Louisiana, conducting outdoor concerts in immense humidity and heat. I think there was one concert where we had to time the concert so that the interval happened when the termites flew. So at a certain point at dusk, the termites were going to come out, and they were going to, and it's quite dangerous for termites to land on the string instruments. So we had to time it so that I had to have the interval so that musicians could go and hide away. Termites came out and flew for about 15 minutes, and then we went back on and had the second half of the things we go through as performers. And then I'll share one other one in terms of conducting in the heat, where in Houston, I was assistant conductor with the Houston Symphony for 2 years, and outdoor concerts at their Miller Theater in sweltering heat as well. I mean, I've never conducted where in the second bar I was already drenched. It's like, and I had a choice between being able to hear the musicians or having the air conditioning on me. Now, the air conditioning consisted of 2 like blower fans at my feet that made so much noise that I couldn't really hear the orchestra. So I had to tell them, the stage crew, whether I wanted the air on or the air off. The air off meant I could hear the orchestra, but I was drenched. The air on meant that maybe I had a little bit of breeze up my trouser legs, but I couldn't hear the orchestra. So this is how we get through socially distanced or difficult circumstances on stage. I suppose what I remember about that though is that I had to be even more convincing, and I had to hear even more the music in my head and be completely convinced and conduct with conviction in those circumstances. So maybe that's a lesson for the future, Tom. Don't know.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I thank you for coming to this. That's all the time we have now for questions, unfortunately. What I would like to do before I officially sign off is take a quick snapshot of my screen with all our smiling faces in, if that's okay with everyone, just to show that we're actually together and we are having lots of fun. So which is why I want to encapsulate this, if that's okay. So after 3, I would like you to smile and I will take a picture.
Okay.
Thank you. So in 1, 2, 3. I mean, you look beautiful. Thank you so much. And finally, just a heartfelt thank you for Rebecca's time and for doing this as part of Festival Interrupted. It's been frank, it's been really heartfelt, super insightful. And as I said, that presentation needs to be created into some sort of text for student conductor or just anybody really who was looking into leadership, community, collective, all of the above. So a heartfelt thank you for that. As I've mentioned, this is being recorded, so if anybody wanted to watch back, if they joined us a little bit later, it'll be on the Festival Interrupted website, which is www.festivalinterrupted.org.uk. If not, drop me an email and I can send that forward to you. And yeah, thank you once again, most importantly to Rebecca for a little emoji clap I'm going to put there. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you to Nathan for putting this together, and thanks everybody for joining. It was really nice to see all your faces in this strange new sort of world that we're in, and I'm really happy to see people join from around the world. I see some of my friends and family from around the world, and that couldn't happen without COVID, so maybe a silver lining.
One silver lining, yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca. And once again, thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.